Okay, it is October 15th, I think, 2019. This is your Tuesday warm-up after Thanksgiving on chapters 3.1 and 3.2. The first question gives you P, R, M, and SF. This, of course, stands for power and repeated multiplication and standard form, or just your answer if you wanted to think of it that way. Standard form. So the first one said 5 to the exponent of 3. Now what this means is take the base and multiply it by itself 3 times. So in repeated multiplication, it would be 5 multiplied by itself 3 times. 5 times 5 is 25, times 5 is 125 in standard form. Now the next question I'm sure most of you got wrong. But if you interpret this as being the opposite of 2 times 2, 2 times 2 times 2, then the opposite of 2 times 2 times 2 exponentially is simply negative 2 as a base without brackets. Without brackets around the negative 2. That means in repeated multiplication, the negative 2 is not multiplied by itself 3 times, but rather the opposite of 2 cubed. Now some people are wondering why. Well, if it was this, for example, in repeated multiplication, it would be negative 2 multiplied by itself 3 times. Now, even though they would be the same standard form answer, they are not the same in repeated multiplication. So we must interpret this as being the opposite of 2 cubed and not negative 2 cubed. So in standard form, the opposite of 2 times 2, since 2 times 2 times 2 is 8, the opposite of that would be negative 8. Now, just as an aside, if I was to give you this question, this would have been a better question because this says in repeated multiplication, it's the opposite of 2 times 2, which would have given you a negative 4 standard form. Most people think that this is the same thing as this, and they're not. They are not equal. And the third question gives you 1,000 and asks you to write as a power in a repeated multiplication. There are probably a few different answers, 2 different answers. You could have written 10 cubed, which would be 10 multiplied by 10 multiplied by 10. You could have also written 1,000 to the exponent of 1, which in repeated multiplication is just 1,000, which would have been that. You could have also written, I suppose, the opposite of negative 10 cubed, which would have been a repeated multiplication, the opposite of negative 10 times negative 10 times negative 10, because negative 10 times negative 10 times negative 10 is negative 1,000, and the opposite of that would have been negative 1,000. So most of you probably put this and this, but the other 2 answers are technically okay. Your second question says the power of 2 cubed times 2 cubed. Now remember, what we learned last day is you can keep the base and add the exponents to give you 2 to the power of 6, which would be 2 multiplied by itself 3 times, or 2 to the cubed multiplied by 2 cubed. In standard form, 2 to the exponent of 6 is 2, 4, 8, 16, 32, 64. So in standard form it is that. The next one would be 4 to the exponent of 4 divided by 4 squared. I don't need brackets around that. So as a power or a product of powers or as the quotient of powers, I would use that. And therefore the answer would be, what's right? Simply 16 in standard form. And here 2 cubed cubed in repeated multiplication is 2 cubed multiplied by itself 3 times, or 2 times 2 times 2 multiplied by 2 times 2 times 2 multiplied by 2 times 2 times 2, which would be 2 multiplied by itself 9 times, which is what the rule is keep the base and add or multiply the exponents. 2, 4, 8, 16, 32, 64, 128, 256, 512, 512 is your standard form. And finally, the last 2 questions are just giving you a power and asking you to put it in standard form. So negative 2 to the power of 4 is negative 2 times negative 2 times negative 2 times negative 2, which is positive 16, or just 16. This would be the opposite of 2 times 2 times 2 times 2. And since 2 times 2 times 2 times 2 is 16, the opposite of that would be negative 16. This one would be negative 10 multiplied by itself 3 times, which is negative 1,000. Anything to the exponent of 1 is just the base itself. The base in the next one is negative 6, and any base to the exponent of 0, we said last time, was 1, except for the last question, because the base is not negative 6. In the very last question, the base is not 6. It is 6. So this technically says the opposite of 6 to the 0. And since 6 to the 0 is 1, the opposite of that is negative 1.